I'm back, but I'm not sure anybody else is. We seem to be having a problem with the live feed this evening for some reason, and I can't tell you why. I've been knocked off twice since I went on. So let's keep trying. If this continues, I'll have to discontinue the feed and perhaps go on my iPhone and try that. It's kind of blinking here in a way I don't like. Let's begin with the collect for Martin Luther King. Almighty God, by the hand of Moses, your servant, you led your people out of slavery and made them free at last. Grant that your church, following the example of your prophet Martin Luther King, may resist oppression in the name of your love and may strive to secure for all your children the blessed liberty of the gospel of Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. So if I get knocked off again, know that I'll come back on, or at least try to, so don't run away. Also remember that tonight's session, as the previous four in this series has been, will be archived at Church of the Redeemer's Facebook page and at our YouTube channel if you want to go back and look at it later. I ended session four this past November 9th by noting the signing by President Lyndon Johnson on August 6th of 1965 of the Voting Rights Act of that year. Johnson signed the act in the same room when on August 6th, the same date, 1861, President Abraham Lincoln had signed the bill freeing slaves impressed into the service of the Confederacy. The symbolism of Johnson's signing on the same August date and in the same room as Lincoln could not have been clearer. And in a sense, this was the high tide in the effort to get blacks the vote through the power of federal law. So from that date forward, the politics of the South began to change, and they have changed forever. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 potentially opened up voting for, think of this, 2.5 million Southern blacks who had never been able to vote before. And as we'll note in a minute, some of them didn't even know how to vote, what it even meant. So the first part of tonight's session on the first part of 1966 could be subtitled, Black Power, Southern Blacks Vote. I want to discuss what happened after the signing of the act and King's involvement in that. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a law which had some teeth in it. It gave the Attorney General of the United States the power to send federal registrars, federal officials, with the power of the federal government behind them, to register. And they could be sent into counties where there was evidence of discrimination. It abolished poll taxes, it abolished literacy tests, and some other roadblocks that had been used to block blacks from voting. King and the organization that he led, and you may remember it's the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they were not naive about the passage of this bill. They knew that the Voting Rights Act simply opened up the possibility for Southern blacks to vote. It was not a guarantee. The SCLC, therefore, determined it would need a strong campaign to raise the consciousness of Southern blacks, most of whom had never voted, and get their names listed on voting rosters. In session 2 of this series, I can't remember the date, it's been a while, I made the point that King firmly believed and taught that oppressed people had an obligation themselves to resist oppression. In doing so, they would establish and then reinforce their own human destiny. In the case of exercising the right to vote for the first time, however, many Southern blacks needed help in order to get started. They had never done this before. So the SLC leadership initially had thought that the Voting Rights Act would be enacted in June of 1965, not August. So when it was not enacted in June, as a reaction to that, King announced that the SCLC would organize an all-out registration drive, concentrating on 120 rural counties across the South where blacks comprised at least 40% of the population. So in those 2 months, from June to August, leading up to the signing of the act, 1,500 volunteers from all over the United States spread out across these rural counties of the South in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, North and South Carolina, and yes, Florida. King and the SCLC staff organized what were called people-to-people tours to educate voters in not only how to register to vote, but equally important, how to read a ballot. Many of the blacks were semi-literate because of poor schools and were unfamiliar with this most basic step of voting. You and I know how to vote, but what would it be like to never have voted and be an adult and live for decades? I'm going to try to show some photos tonight. I'm going to use another device, my iPhone, to do this. I think this will work. And I want to show you some photos involved in getting these people ready to vote. So for example, we have a white registrar, and you can see him signing up a black gentleman, and you can see a line of blacks waiting to register to vote. You can also see in this photo that was taken at the time the difficulty that some were having in understanding what a ballot even was. Here's a photo of King, probably at a church, on one of these people-to-people tours, encouraging blacks to register and probably also telling them how to do it. So this was really a tremendous effort to get this started. King and his volunteers, when they would talk to people, would patiently explain the voting procedure, what it was like. And then they also, in addition to that, organized some public meetings where blacks could meet and hear local candidates, which they had never heard before. King believed that the voting ballot was the political weapon for fighting white oppression and for beginning the process of blacks taking control of their own destinies. In other words, you have to fight the oppression. The greatest gains in black voter registration occurred, surprising to me, but nevertheless in Alabama, of all places. In the 7 months following passage of the Voting Rights Act, again in August of '65, 7 months later, 300,000 blacks were registered for the first time. And with 4 exceptions, the southern states had registered over 50% of their eligible black voters. By August of 1966, black voter registration in Alabama increased from just 23% to 51%. There was another impact that black registration and voting had, and that is it had the effect of creating a new political environment where white candidates who had more moderate views than the traditional segregationist white candidate could get elected. They were able to win for the first time because of black votes supporting them. Case in point, if you saw session 4 of this series, the last one on November 9th, I described some of the violent actions of Sheriff Jim Clark of Dallas County, Alabama, where Selma is located. Violent actions taken against demonstrators and so-called would-be voters, and I've got a photo of him I want to show you. These are your friendly Jim Clark. He doesn't look violent there, but he was a very violent segregationist and developed various techniques to keep people from registering to vote or even coming to the courthouse to try. Sheriff Clark in 1966 was up for re-election, and guess what? He was a staunch segregationist, and guess what? He was defeated by a moderate Wilson Baker. So he had this impact beyond black voting to encourage more moderate white candidates to challenge segregationist candidates. Even in dreaded Lowndes County, progress was made. Now listen to this. In 1965, 80% of the population of Lowndes County was black. Yet, not one black voter was listed on the voting rolls, not one. By the time of the political party primaries in the fall, over 2,700 blacks had been registered. So one quote I found by Victor Hugo, I think, sums it up about the impact of the Voting Rights Act, an idea whose time had come. With the voting ballot, Southern blacks now had the ability to give direction to their destinies. Another source I researched stated it this way, and I like this. When black people speak with their votes, legislators are forced to listen. And the more votes there are, the more they pay attention. Of course, that's generally true, isn't it? All during this time that I've just been discussing, King kept pressuring the national administration in Washington, in particular President Johnson, to strongly enforce the Voting Rights Act. After all, it had teeth in it, but you still have to apply it. And I have an iconic photo of Martin Luther King and LBJ. And you can just tell what's going on between the two of them. If I can find it. I had it. Here it is. This is a very famous photo. Only you can't see that. Let's see what happened. There it is. What's that? Hold on a sec. See Johnson sort of listening and listening, and King is making his point. And Johnson is already really starting to show his age as president with everything that was going on. If an idea whose time has come is true, voting for blacks, then it had to be constantly attended to. There have always been forces in our country who are willing to deprive blacks of the vote and other civil rights if given the opportunity, and that still continues. For example, the Johnson administration ended in January of 1969, following the election of Richard Nixon in the fall of 1968. Under the provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, 900 counties were eligible for federal intervention because the populations of these counties were at least 40% black, which meant there was a presumption if you had 40% or more black population, there was a presumption that voting was being denied to blacks. 900 counties. As of 1975, 10 years later, only 103 counties of those 900 had federal assistance, and no federal referees, whatever, were sent into the South during the administration of Richard Nixon. It was also during this time period, heading into and including the year 1966, that the mood of the freedom movement was beginning to change. I had mentioned throughout this series that the movement in the South was originally, and it came out of the black churches, was originally called the Freedom Movement. It was only later that the term civil rights movement became prominent. If you compare those two, freedom versus civil rights, you could at least interpret that to mean that freedom is too broad a term. We're going to limit it to civil rights. For example, during the black voter registration drive in dreaded Lowndes County, another civil rights leader, very famous one, and you may have heard of him, Stokely Carmichael, organized a county freedom organization. And as part of his effort, he organized a primary election protest vote, an alternative to the traditional political parties, calling his new party, and some of you will remember this, the Black Panther Party. And I have a photo of a ballot that was used by that party. Again, if I can find it, here it is. You can see how you mark the ballot and then look at the Black Panther stamped on the ballot. So this was a protest against any existing political party. Carmichael's effort, even in that awful county, was not successful, but because of his efforts in trying to encourage black registration, he became president of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, called SNCC, in May of 1966, and became the leading advocate of Black Power. SNCC was another organization among many, including SCLC, but many others, working for Black freedom. Sometimes they partnered with King, and sometimes they were competitors. And when we use the term freedom, we're using a term which has different meanings to different people. Some in the freedom movement had become cynical about ever attaining racial justice or equality simply through the graces or the consent of white people. Something more was needed. And it wasn't just the mood of the freedom movement that was changing. The mood of our entire country was also changing. And I was certainly socially aware then, and I remember this. There had been riots across America in 1964 and 65. The most famous probably is the Watts riot in Los Angeles. And increasing numbers of American troops were gradually being committed to an ongoing war out there in way out there in Southeast Asia, in a place called Vietnam. Indeed, if you remember Bloody Sunday, when the marchers were beaten by Alabama state troopers when they crossed that bridge in Selma, on that very same day, March 7th, 1965, the 1st U.S. Combat Division landed in Vietnam. And just 4 months later, the military requested that President Johnson deploy 200,000 more troops to Vietnam. The point of this is that Vietnam was becoming more on the conscience of the country. So in response to the growing unrest within the freedom movement and the declining interest by Americans in what was now happening in the South, King was confronted with a dilemma, and this is the first time this has happened in the movement, the freedom movement. It was a moral dilemma, and it was a test of his moral courage. And here it is succinctly in a sentence. Was nonviolent resistance the only effective strategy for social change available to Black people? Let me repeat that. Was nonviolent resistance the only effective strategy for social change available to Black people? In light of these challenges and the way this question is just posed, King and his staff wrote an article for the October 1966 edition of Ebony magazine, which was a prominent national publication for Black readers. And I want to share with you some quotes from that article. Again, this is October 1966 in Ebony magazine. And while it reflects not only King's writing, but also some of his assistants, it certainly reflects his thinking. He writes, the year 1966 brought with it the first public challenge to the philosophy and strategy of nonviolence from within the ranks of the civil rights movement. Resolutions of self-defense and Black power sounded forth from our friends and brothers. He goes on to write, I can only conclude that the Negro, even in his bitterest moments, is not intent on killing white men to be free. This does not mean that the Negro is a saint who abhors violence. Unfortunately, a check of the hospitals in any Negro community on any Saturday night will make you painfully aware of the violence within the Negro community. Hundreds of victims of shooting and cutting lie bleeding in the emergency rooms, but there is seldom if ever a white person who is the victim of Negro hostility. Goes on to write, I am convinced that for practical as well as moral reasons, nonviolence offers the only road to freedom for my people. In violent warfare, one must be prepared to face ruthlessly the fact that there will be casualties by the thousands. In Vietnam, the United States has evidently decided it is willing to do that. There is no time for romantic illusions about freedom and empty philosophical debate. This is a time for action. What is needed is a strategy for change, a tactical program which will bring the Negro into the mainstream of American life as quickly as possible. So far, this has only been offered by the nonviolent movement. Right, so it's always amusing to me when a Negro man says that he can't demonstrate with us because if someone hit him, he would fight back. Here is a man whose children are being plagued by rats and roaches, whose wife is robbed daily at overpriced ghetto food stores, who himself is working for about two-thirds the pay of white persons doing a similar job and with similar skills. And in spite of all this daily suffering, it takes someone spitting on him or calling him a nigger to make him want to fight. When my home was bombed in 1955 in Montgomery, many men wanted to retaliate, to place an armed guard on my house. But the issue there was not my life, but whether Negroes would achieve first-class treatment on the city's buses. Had we become distracted by the question of my safety, we would have lost the moral offensive and sunk to the level of our oppressors. I must continue by faith, or it is too great a burden to bear, and violence, even in self-defense, creates more problems than it solves. Only a refusal to hate or kill can put an end to the chain of violence in the world and lead us toward a community where men can live together without fear. Our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls as well as a quantitative change in our lives. There must be a spiritual or a religious change as well. Now, I could go on, but I think that's enough. It's an interesting article. It's in Ebony Magazine, the October 1966 issue, and probably available online as well as in written publications. So, just to run the few quotes I offered, King remained steadfast in his belief that nonviolence resistance is the only road to freedom. Now, I want to discuss, secondly, second part of this session tonight, another nonviolent resistance effort that happened in 1966. This effort also puts a light on the growing split, as I just mentioned, within the freedom movement as to strategy. And you could call the second part of tonight's session the Southern Black Power Challenge. I didn't cover the 1962 admission of James Meredith to the law school at the University of Mississippi because King did not have any direct involvement in that, but certainly he and the SCLC were supportive of it. He was admitted in 1962 after protracted resistance, violence, and finally federal government intervention and forced the law school to admit him. 4 years later, in June of 1966, James Meredith set out on his own on a march through the state of Mississippi. I have a photo of him getting ready to march. You can see him there. He's sitting down and he's about to put on hiking boots, I believe. That's sort of how I remember he looked as well. So he set on this march on his own through the state of Mississippi to quote his words, to test the progress of his home state, since he was a native Mississippian. And he also said to challenge his own courage. Meredith and four of his friends set out from Memphis, Tennessee, which is just north of the Mississippi state line, on June 6th. His intention was that this march was a personal statement on his part, and he didn't want any press coverage. The next day, the very next day, Meredith was shot, and the early press reporting was that he had been shot dead. So I have a picture of that. There he is, lying after having been shot. He had been shot, but he was not dead. He had sustained some superficial wounds. One source said he had 60 pellets of birdshot in his shoulder. But he refused treatment in any Mississippi hospital, and he went back to Memphis. King and all the other major leaders came to the hospital to visit him in Mississippi, in Memphis rather. And they and him decided or determined that the march should continue. So it resumed on June 8th. From the spot Meredith was shot. The march was 3 weeks long, covering 200 miles. I have a picture of that. Maybe. There you can see the march through Mississippi. King is in the front row with the hat on. Next to him is his wife, Coretta. And to her right is Ralph Abernathy, his longtime friend and Baptist colleague, Baptist pastor colleague, and part of the SCLC as well. So it was 3 weeks long and 200 miles. The marchers slept in tents at night, and as they traveled through the small towns of Mississippi, they also tried to register voters along the way. It is during this march that the use of the term Black Power became an issue. Stokely Carmichael, as I mentioned earlier, who's now the head of SNCC, first used the term Black Power as a slogan during this march in Grenada, Mississippi. When he used that term, King objected and suggested black equality as an alternative, but the younger leaders would have none of King's alternative. Also, what developed during this march was that King participated. He participated, but his leadership was challenged, and nonviolent resistance was openly questioned. Carmichael, for example, had originally envisioned the march as an all-black march. He's quoted as saying, "We don't need any more white phonies and liberals invading our movement." King threatened to pull out his support, and through his own personal persuasion, the march continued, and it was nonviolent on the part of the marchers, and whites were welcome. So, except for this ongoing internal friction about strategy and who should now be a leader, the march was peaceful until it reached Philadelphia, Mississippi. There, white mobs threw cherry bombs, and fighting followed, and the police did nothing to stop it. King said, "That day in Philadelphia, when I was speaking and Sheriff Rainey was behind me." Now, Sheriff Rainey was the sheriff of that county, of Philadelphia's in, but he was also charged with murder because of the 3 civil rights workers who were murdered in Mississippi and buried in an earthen dam and finally discovered. He was indicted already for that, but he was still active as sheriff. King says, "That day in Philadelphia, when I was speaking and Sheriff Rainey was behind me, and I started saying the murderers were probably around, and some man behind me said, 'You're damn right. They're right behind you.' I was there speaking. They're all standing behind me. And I just knew I'd never see the end of the day." That night, the marchers were attacked by rifle fire. When the marchers reached Canton, Mississippi on June 24, the city denied them a permit to camp on the grounds of an all-black elementary school. Marchers gathered some local blacks and they all moved in and started making camp anyway. Local and state police threw grenades of tear gas at them. It reminded King of Bloody Sunday in Selma. None of the protesters were arrested, but they were beaten, kicked, and clubbed by state police. James Meredith joined that march on its last stretch into Jackson, the state capital. And the crowd gathered in Jackson was 15,000. At that time, it was the largest gathering of blacks in Mississippi history. It may still be. But by now, King's role as leader was secondary. At the rally in Jackson, he was only allowed to speak. He was not the leader of the rally. So the freedom movement, in effect, had become fragmented. King said, "I've decided that I'm going to do battle for my philosophy. You ought to believe something in life, believe that thing so fervently that you will stand up with it till the end of your days. I can't make myself believe that God wants me to hate. I'm afraid of violence, and I'm not going to let my oppressor dictate to me what method I must use. We have power, power that cannot be found in bullets and guns. In other words, moral power." So by the summer and early fall of 1966 in the South, we have two contrasting developments. First, black voting registration and black voting itself have increased dramatically. Second, the freedom movement has become fragmented, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is challenged. His nonviolent resistance strategy is questioned by some because of the perception of slow progress in areas other than voting, for example, in jobs and in housing. It's at this point in the summer of 1966 that King is very discouraged and very troubled. In my next session, which I hope to have around April 4, which is the assassination date in 1968 of King, it won't be April 4th because that's Easter Day this year, but it'll be sometime around there. I'm going to touch on one last effort in 1966, and that was King went north to Chicago, and in part to test his strategy in the north. And then I will also include in the next session the 1967, which is the pivotal year, King's last full year of life, and his turning his moral courage outside of the South and toward more economic issues, and in particular, Vietnam. Thank you for watching tonight. This is a little shorter than, well, maybe it isn't a little shorter. I'd planned it that way. Remember, everything is archived, and you can go back and look at it. And if any of you have any ideas, anything you'd like me to touch on while I'm still doing this series on King, please let me know. Or if you have any ideas for formation, Christian formation, you can let me know that or let Father Wood. We're very open to hearing from you. So thank you again for watching, and I wish you a pleasant evening.